What's going on, family? It's your brother Lawrence here with another episode of Watch God Work. In every episode, we get the distinct pleasure to talk to brothers and sisters who are doing exceptional work in every field of human endeavor, in business, in culture, in civic leadership, in art, you name it. And they get to share their God stories, the ways in which God has been at work in their life, and the ways in which God's hand has been at work through their work. And today is no different. I am excited to introduce our sister, Olivia Omega. What's going on, Olivia?
Hey, what's going on? Thanks for having me.
Y'all, sometimes I have such trepidation, and I get out of the way of introducing people because their stat sheet, their credits are so long. And Olivia's one of those people where I'm just like, I can call her a maven of brand strategy in the industry, the global brands that you've come to know and love. Olivia's probably at some point in her career has had her hands on it. Her being the CEO of the Wallace Group, that continues to do that work as in addition to the diversity and inclusion, equity and inclusion work that is so critical in these times. On top of being an amazing author, and having a specific guide of beautifully branded The Girl's Guide, Understand, and the Personal Anatomy of You. I think about a sister coming up in Colorado. I'm not going to put the years, but people will be able to guess anyway. And I'm just thinking about the genesis story of your experience just early on. One, understanding what your skills and gift sets are, and then two, your relationship with God. Because if we zoom back many years ago, we'd be talking to the pediatrician to be, right? And so I would love to hear for you, number one, who is Olivia Omega, and take us back to growing up, and how did you first start to get a sense of your skill sets and your gifts, and then ultimately how you were introduced to God.
Wow. Who am I? So I was born in upstate New York, right outside of Buffalo and Rochester, but moved to Colorado really pretty young. So I was probably 6 or 7 when we moved out here. And interestingly enough, our dad always had us in communities that were predominantly white. And in context for my dad, it's interesting. He grew up in the South, Georgia, small town in Georgia, and changed his name young. He was in Vietnam, came back from the war, and there's a whole other, story and just PTSD involved with that piece. And coming back to an America that didn't appreciate veterans and didn't appreciate the Black man. So he changed his name, and that's how I got the name Omega. And interestingly enough, he named us so that people couldn't tell what we were by reading our name intentionally. And so coming to Colorado, growing up in predominantly white neighborhoods, and grappling with being different and being the only Black person in every room I was in. From school, we were homeschooled for a stint there. High school, same story. College, same story. Corporate, same story. And so that has created a lens at which I see things. And I think where my focus now on personal branding and authenticity and belonging really stems from is, how do I show up in these rooms and bring my whole self and truly be Olivia, while knowing that there's this, it's not even a pressure, it's just this desire to fit in. How do I stand out and also want to belong? So that's kind of, I've jumped ahead a little bit, but when I was younger, I started my first company at 13. I learned how to sew. My mom taught me how to sew when I was 6. And so I was making things and selling and all of that stuff. And I think it was, as you mentioned, I did truly want to be a pediatrician. I had a love for kids and a huge kind of obsession with biology until high school. And I started taking biology and physics and chemistry. And it just wasn't, I was just kind of like, oh, this is great. And this is exciting. But I caught this marketing bug in high school and joined DECA. And DECA is an organization in various high schools for business, and started competing and doing really, really well, and started writing business plans at my junior, senior year in high school, and always kind of found myself watching the ads during the Super Bowl and not caring as much about the game, and analyzing that, and really becoming interested in this notion of human psychology and how that plays into marketing and how that plays into business. So towards the end of my senior year in high school, I decided I'm going to major in marketing. I attended the University of Colorado at Boulder, and just went all the way with marketing. I got an internship at an ad agency, and the more I got into that agency, realizing it was not as much an ad agency, but more of a brand positioning agency. And this was 15 some years ago. I started to make up numbers because it's so long ago. I'm like, oh, that was decades ago. Actually, it was 20 years ago, 21 years ago when I started working there as an intern. And then when I graduated, they didn't have a job for me. So I moved to New York City and started working at Ogilvy Mather, and just started this whole new life in New York and at a huge, massive agency, and realized after a little bit that the city was great to visit, but not necessarily to live. I missed my family, and but also the cutthroat atmosphere of being at a global agency just wasn't what I was prepared for at 20, 21 years old. So I got a phone call from Boulder saying that the agency I was at previously had a job for me, and that it was perfect. And it was with Lay's potato chips, or working on the Lay's potato chip brand. And ironically enough, and it wasn't until years later, as I retell kind of the story, that I really realized the damaging place or focus that that first assignment had. And it was because the agency I was with was hired by Frito-Lay, Lay's, to position Lay's potato chips. This is back, I think, a long time ago when they first came out with chili lime and all of these new flavors. How do we position Lay's to grab more African American and Hispanic consumers? How do we sell more junk food, more salt, more snacks to people of color? And that's why they brought me back and brought me in. I stayed there for on and off for 10 years. I did a lot of consulting there as well. And then during this time, I'm having a family and I'm doing all these things, and finding that, driving to Boulder an hour each way, 3 hours each way in the snow, and traveling and not seeing my kids wasn't something that I wanted to continue. So I left there and started my own consultancy, and have been doing that for almost 10 years now, and working in a variety of areas, from nonprofit to women in business, and helping a lot of women start companies. And then even more recently, with the events of the past year, really helping people take a lens of diversity, equity, inclusion to their marketing and communications and personal brands.
This, I love all this in there. I'm gonna unpack a bit, because the first question I always ask, I think sometimes we forget, the greatest storyteller of all time is God, right? Jesus. Jesus was an amazing storyteller, and just the ability to be in a place where you're helping to position stories being told, things being understood about brands. It's a powerful thing. Did you see it from a God lens early on, even just advertising in general? Was that connection made early, or was that something that you kind of over time started to kind of pull back?
The connection wasn't made early. And I remember very clearly being not going to church, not knowing anything, about God, but understanding religion and spirituality a little bit, until about 14, 15, going to a youth group because we were bored. And I think that's how it starts for a lot of people. You go to youth group, you're bored, your parents need something for you to do. And learning who God is, and having a very strong, I'll never forget. People have dates. I don't know dates, but I do remember I was 15 and just had the most amazing encounter with God that left an impact on me. But never did I connect education maybe a little bit, praying that God would direct my path and end me at the right school and the right job, right? So it's almost like, Lord, help me in this area. But connecting that to my work and the business and marketing and advertising really didn't start to happen until I left the agency, brought on my own clients and my own consultancy, and had a couple instances, a couple clients where you're doing everything right. You know, you're doing what you know to do. I've been in the business, and I think one of my last podcasts talks about this is, you got this hat on of 20 years of branding. Like that's a long time, and seeing the evolution of branding over 2 decades. So I know that I'm doing the right thing, but why are we not seeing results? Like what's you here? Or when you try something and from a natural perspective and the natural eye, this should be working. This should be getting my client results. We should be getting, leads. We should be increasing revenue, blah, blah, blah. And when that happened, I was like, Lord, what's the problem? And God specifically told me, this was probably 6-7 years ago, you've separated me from your work. You over here personally, and then when it comes to your business, you don't consult me. And he was like, I will show you what to do, where to go. I will whisper the mysteries of God to you, even in the technicalities of digital marketing and Facebook advertising and, all of these different things. So it was at that point where I started to pray for my clients and build that bridge from my personal faith and to make it my professional faith. And
no, continue.
no, I was just gonna say 2016 is when I officially, like, on my website and in my own marketing and in how I do business, said, okay, God, I'm gonna give you the CEO seat in my company, and I'm gonna take that passenger seat. I'm gonna let you drive, and I'm gonna truly be your vessel.
I think this is going to help people. One, because this wasn't a day one thing. It was having enough grace to recognize that, wow, there's a gap between who I am in Christ and who I am and that coming to work. Because I do think people, when they hear this idea of like bringing God to my work, and it sometimes feel like, did I miss the boat or not? And I think in your story, it'll free people up to say, wow, this could happen at any time, and it's never too late for me to start to incorporate it. I want to talk about this because one of the things you talk about going into business, it wasn't because you had this grand vision of business; it was by necessity. But also,
Yes.
there's a theme that you touch on, which is bringing your authentic self. And what a lot of people struggle with, I think, in the workplace is that they understand the politics of it and says, I can't really do that. But then, I can't really do that. Like, we all know that, right? And so how does your God lens allow people to do it in a practical way? Because someone could argue, say, wait, but you left and had to start on your own. So then how, are you really able to bring your authentic self? Is this great myth, particularly for us, particularly for young women, Black women, particularly for Black, is that really possible? How does God inform how you think about that conversation, right, in view of the realities of what these places are?
That's a great question. And I just did a talk on this last week as well. There's a foundation that we need to have in God and knowing who God says we are, and that courage and comfort in knowing that He's directing our path. So until I was able to say, okay, God, I know you got me. I know you got this. And whatever happens, I know you have a plan. Then I could kind of like breathe a little bit and put aside this notion of constantly nitpicking and overthinking every little thing that I did in the workplace. I would literally stand in the mirror and think, is this too loud? I put on a head wrap and take the head wrap off and put on a head wrap and take it off because I was overthinking every little thing. Are these hoops too big? Are all of this stuff? Giving it over to God allowed me to breathe and relax a little bit. So I'll say that. And then the second thing is this comes with time. And I want to say age. I feel like every decade, every 10 years, I know I know this will happen again at 50, but every with every age, I feel like I get more and more comfortable in my skin and less holding on so tightly to this need of being accepted and need for people at my job to welcome all parts of me.
Mm.
It's still, and it's still human. I mean, that we all have that. Again, it's this tug of war of I need to belong and I want to be accepted and I want to be myself and I want to be original and I want to stand out, and how those two things butt heads and work together. So it's very tricky. So um, giving it over to God, understanding and knowing that this just comes with time and age, that it's not overnight. And then the last thing I'll say is um, re repositioning in our mind that notion of bringing my whole self to
Mm.
work, authenticity versus assimilation,
Mm. Mm.
and the price you pay, right? The price, what am I going to pay for being authentic, and how much do I need to assimilate? And this was brought up a couple conversations I had last week of code switching and the danger of it, but also the need, the politics, right? A lot of us didn't get to where we are in corporate life and where we are in the world by just 100% bringing all of our stuff.
Mhm.
Um, I'll say for me, it was a balance of I want to be myself, but also I know what I need to do in this job to get to where I want to go.
Mm.
When we get to a place where we are um, not being true to who we are not being true to God, and we are being completely unauthentic and fake in order to get to where we want to go. That's very hurtful to our own spirit, to who we are, right? But if we shift it to say, I'm going to be me, but I know, and I don't know if you've experienced this, if I'm on the phone with my mom, I'm Olivia, but this is what we talk about. This is who I am. If I'm on the phone with my husband, it's different.
Mm.
If I'm on the phone with my girlfriend from high school, if I'm on the phone with my kids.
Mm.
So I'm bringing my authentic self to these conversations, but I may present myself in a slightly different way based on that audience and based on that situation. So assimilation and code switching only is bad when we are not being true to who we are, not being true to who God says we are, and when we are completely being fake and unauthentic in a situation.
Mm.
Now, hopefully that answers the
No,
question.
it really does, because part of the reason why I'm so I love your work is that that's a sleeping giant issue, right? This issue of, how much do I bring? What are the trade-offs? I even think about just kind of like Exodus in that time when the Pharaoh had told the women to kill the firstborn, and they kind of lied. They're like, oh man, they're so crafty, they made a trade-off. They lied, right? Given the context of say, I want to honor God, I have to kind of maneuver this, right, in order to kind of honor God in the situation. And I think similarly, there are many brothers and sisters, whether that have to I think what I'm hearing from what you say is that you have to kind of be very clear about who you are, and continue to do inventory about who you are. I also think there's an element of discernment. You're not so much giving people a clear rubric, a hardcore rubric to look at, because I think that's the trade-off, right? I think brothers and sisters feel that to say, you know what, I can't bring who I am fully to this, but I'm here to support my family. And I know if I fully do that, this is going to make them uncomfortable. This is going to this is going to happen. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to torpedo my career. So I know this is not right. I know I'm not bringing my full self, but I am intentionally making the trade off. And I just think that the fact that you explore this space is going to be helpful for people. I want to touch on this because I think what I think people could really gain from you is just, again, helpful frameworks just to start to have the conversation. I think you brought up Frito Lay. I've had brothers and sisters in faith who worked in the spirits industry, who worked in had tensions about their work, tensions, right? And it wasn't so much for me telling. I just said, like, that's a conversation with you and God around what we're calling to do. But often this idea of branding sometimes gets a bad rap. It's the icky branding. It seems so inauthentic. For you, how do you define it for people when you talk about personal brand and branding, particularly for people? And how do you orient it in a kingdom perspective for people? Because I think, unfortunately, sometimes branding sometimes gets a bad rap from people when they think about it in and of itself.
Right. Branding, definitely. Branding, marketing, selling something to someone that they don't need, all of these things, it definitely does get a bad rap. And I worked on Jose Cuervo and some other brands as well back in the day. And I think as you were talking about that, I'm like, God never said to me, quit the agency, don't work here anymore, or quit this, tell your boss you can't work on this brand anymore, or whatever. But that was also so long ago. And I feel like what you said is perfect, of discernment and really spending time with God, and understanding to hear his voice, even in that whisper, to know, do I stay? Do I move? Do I raise my hand and say, this isn't for me, or I can no longer do this because it goes against my faith? I think truly listening is important in that, and having that discernment. As far as the definition of branding and brand strategy, brand positioning, it really is as simple as taking parts of a brand, and this is the look, the feel, the language, the sounds. And Skype is interesting because Skype kind of was that first, way back in the day, to create original, unique sounds that tie to its brand. So when you heard the dinging, I think Yahoo did this as well, and Amazon, way back when it was just email. The sound of getting an email, or the sound of a Skype call coming in, would denote this brand. And so it's for us as people, it's the way we talk, it's our voice, it's our face, our smile, our the way we dress, but it's also our values and what we stand for. So it's taking all of those things and bundling it up together, and then communicating it in a way where other people can truly understand that, and understand the difference between one brand and another, one person, other. And so if we are putting out a bland, plain, keep it safe, I'm just going to float by the radar brand of ourselves, that can be safe and it can be okay. But how do I differentiate you to the person from the person next to you? I don't know who you truly are, if I don't know your values, if I don't know what your voice sounds like. And I can go into a whole other analogies of that, and God, and our relationship with God, and the brand of God, of packaging together the knowledge. We look at the book, we look at the Bible, understanding and hearing his voice. How do we discern and differentiate the voice of God from all of these other voices and messages that we're receiving, if we don't have a full understanding of the brand, or the person, the persona of God?
I think we're both of one mind in there, because initially I was just saying that, God is the brand. Is like when we talk about what we learn about God's character, who God is. It's a branding. It's just like, I did this so you'll remember. I did this so, and so I see that connection. I have to even push this. I want to push this even a step further, because I think even as the way you talk about God and his preeminence and place in these decisions in your life, in your business, I think what I'm curious about, and perhaps people listening and watching, is just like, what made it good news to you when God was introduced in your life? What made it? What was it about God that you say, I need this in my life? Because I think sometimes the biggest gap for people is just that, okay, these are a set of rules, there's things to do. What was it about God that you said, I need this? I need him for the things that I'm doing, for my life, period. Just what was that? What was about God that you loved?
When I first got saved, and so going back to high school and even in college, it was, I needed to feel loved, truly loved. And that wasn't found in my father at the time. And I wasn't feeling that in my home, and I wasn't feeling that necessarily with friends. I didn't have a boyfriend. And so all of these different places where the world would say, this is where you seek and find love, wasn't there. And so when I experienced God, I truly experienced love and comfort that I had never experienced before. And how that transcended from then to now is that the guiding light. We can fumble, especially as an entrepreneur, and a lot of the ways I see my relationship with God, I then can take and apply that to being an entrepreneur and entrepreneurship. But as an entrepreneur, we fumble. As human beings, we fumble and walk around in darkness and just try to figure stuff out. And we go down different paths and like, I'll try this. Let me see if this works. And to have direction and reassurance that it will be okay. That God is constantly saying to me, I see the future. I saw your past. I saw where you came from. I see where you are. I see where you're going. And I have an intended plan for you. And to know that somebody's got that, that God has that for me, that made all of the difference in my entire life and now as an entrepreneur for sure.
I love this. I want to keep pushing this a step further because part of what additionally I think people could hear that there's endless love I have for your work. And one of the other things is that this piece a failure. Think of the times we're living in now. Some people
Mm-hmm.
argue that we're heading into another. This is a recession, heading into another recession. I remember 2008, and their brothers and sisters that were hopping off buildings, right?
Yeah.
Because of what
Yeah.
happened. And there's a conversation that you've been having around failure, right? Around public failure in particular, first attempt in learning, as you define it, in failure, which I love that acronym. Um, how essential do you believe this message is now? Because I think for things have shifted. What is it about for someone? What are they missing about who God sees them as when they lose everything, when they fail, when they don't have anything, when they fail in public, where it's still not enough for them to live? How essential do you feel that's now? What was was this the major impetus around sharing this message around failure, public failure out in the world?
Yeah, and that message rings true in so many ways. And kind of started from this notion of I was married pretty young or fairly young. I was at the end of college, got married, had two kids, had got the house, did all the stuff, was working at the agency, all of these things. And then when I left, I started another company. And when that marriage ended, the company ended, everything fell apart, the house went away, like the car was repossessed, like everything was gone and cracked and crumbled. I was also at that time in a place of pretty uh, high profile in the Denver area for women in entrepreneurship and nationally for women who were CEOs of mom and baby companies. And so being in the public eye for failures such as that had to give me a new appreciation, not a new appreciation, a new relationship with God to understand who I was, regardless of who I thought I appeared to be.
Mm.
So I thought I appear a hot mess. I appear not strong enough to keep my marriage together. I appear too weak to hold the business together because I am, you know, on antidepressants and I'm dealing with all these things. So I really had to dig deep into who God says I am. And I
Mm.
think that that message of in our biggest failures, God still has us and he still sees the treasure that we are. And in those failures, um, what we can take from that is understanding who's got our back and who is in our corner. And when they're public failures, it just gives us an opportunity to shine and grow even brighter. So I always say that unless you have failed, especially in business and in entrepreneurship, you can't get to that next level.
Mm.
And my son is super into video games, and I kind of talk about it as going to next level. So if you, until you fail and you get beat up by the bad guy, whoever's at the end of um, whatever game you're playing, if it's Call of Duty or whoever, whatever, at the end of that level, you've gotten beat up enough that you understand how to succeed and how to win and how to beat the enemy.
Mm.
And then you at next level, and the skill you learned at that last level is not the same skill that you need to get past the second level, and so forth and so on. So in every failure, I see it as a come up.
Mm.
It's like, all right, great. What's next? I see it as a level up. I see it. All right, I'm going to get to that next level. As the pandemic started, so many businesses had to fold, and we've seen that over and over in so many different industries. And here in Denver, there's a list of about 100 long of restaurants that have had to permanently close their doors in COVID, or have had to completely shift and pivot. And the word pivot, I think I heard maybe 1,000 plus times in 2020.
Mm.
And I think of that as not failure in a sense, but shifting, pivoting, changing, adapting, growing, and getting to that next level. It's almost like a graduation point.
Mm,
Even if a business had to shut down for whatever reason, it's like, okay, God, what do you have me to do now?
mm,
What is this next phase and level? Because he saw this. This is not the end of your story. So how have I graduated to the next level? God, what would you have me do now?
mm. There's resurrection only comes after death, right? And I think for brothers and sisters hearing this and seeing this, whether you believe in God, you're still curious, or I think people
Mm-hmm.
could relate to those, things when what you thought, right? There's a number of professional athletes I know where that career ended. Who am I now? The
Right.
business was lost. Who am I now? That there is a toolkit, that there's assurance that I'll be okay, but that my identity is bigger than this, and that I'm being ushered into a whole nother level is, I think, a universal message, as all of God's messages are. And so I appreciate that you share that. I have to ask this around on those only God moments, because you have cultivated such a beautiful community. The God is CEO podcast. You put such helpful content with humility. You kind of share the stumbling. You share those things, and I think that's sometimes rare from people who have achieved so much. Where have you found, just even more recently, these only God moments? Because I think a lot of people talk about just their businesses and their operating, but sometimes God gives us whispers in those only God moments to say, "This is when it happened." Only God. When was the last only God moment you had where you're like, "Oh, this is God. God was working in this because I shouldn't have got this contract, or this shouldn't have happened."
Um, the most recent. So I'm having one come up, and I'm like, do I share about it? Because I'm waiting for the testimony. I'm like 3 weeks out from being able to just say only God.
Mm,
But I will say this: 2.5 years ago, almost 3 years ago, we were trying to buy a house, and being an entrepreneur, not having a W-2, not having, even in tax returns, as an entrepreneur, you file taxes and you take every deduction so that you can show lower income, or, like that you didn't make a ton of money because you had business expenses and, blah, 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 so that you can pay less taxes. It's the entrepreneur, thing. But when you do that, and then you go try to buy a house, and they're like, how are you going to afford this house when you don't make that much money? And so then it's like, okay, then let's file the taxes without taking as many deductions so that we can show we make enough money, but now we owe more money, like this whole thing. So we went into the process of buying a house. And literally, when I tell you, just to get our credit up to where it needed to be, just to save that the down payment, to, like I said, file the taxes so that we were making enough money to then, pay off certain things, to get our debt to income ratio fixed, all of this stuff. We're finally a week from closing, and everything that could possibly go wrong went wrong the week before closing. And it was thing after thing. And even like 3 days before closing, you need to pay off your car because you can't have that debt because your ratio is a little bit off. And I'm like, okay, where am I going to get $4,000 tomorrow? And landed a contract for $4,000 that next day. Literally, the timing was crazy. Only God, only God. And then going into another situation, and I'm having a hard time thinking. If you would have asked me 2 years ago, I could have told you the 20 things that happened that last week,
mm,
and how God just worked in every itty bitty situation, down to who our lender was. And she was not a believer, but God put her in our path,
mm,
and God made it work. To 4 hours before closing, and to be able to close and literally say, this would not have happened if God was not in this.
mm,
There's no way this would not have happened if God was not in this. And so, fast forward 2.5 years later, my husband actually works in that space because of what we were able to learn then, and how God worked and moved then. He has now dedicated his focus and time on helping other families learn the same thing and really praying them through that process.
mm. This is it's those only God moments are a bit chilling sometimes when you see that, right? And I think sometimes there are people who are hungering for that, right? Because they feel a bit burdened by life, and
Yeah.
just a reminder that God is there. They're hoping for that in their business, and knowing the tension of, is it time for me to shut this thing down? Is this something I should do? Is it something I should not do? I see you as this treasure trove of wisdom, particularly for people who are just open to the journey, open to kind of going on that walk and journey with God around their businesses and around their life. I have to. I'm curious about what do you have coming up because I see all that you do, and I think like when people they be like, Lawrence, when do you rest, right? Like how do you how do you maintain a rhythm? Like what is your ideal rhythm with God to allow you to pour out in the way that you do, but keeps you centered? Tactically, like practically, what does that look like for you on a day-to-day basis as a wife, mom, CEO? There's a lot going on. How do you stay connected? What's your ideal rhythm?
And I will start with this to say I am not perfect. And if there is like two things there, it's all coupled together that I struggle with personally is with time management and consistency. And I struggle with that, which is why it's so top of mind for me. And I know as an entrepreneur, and I'm sure you know this, is doing all that we do, getting in that rhythm is super important. And so what I do is I take off the pressure of, and it's like New Year's resolutions that people will say, I'm going to work out 3 times a week and I'm going to get up and pray 5 times a week and I'm going to do this. I take off the pressure of that because when I fail, and then when you fail, you're like, oh, I just missed a whole week of working out. And then it's like, oh, I might as well stop. So what I do is prayer and worship in the morning is the most important thing to me, and I make that a number one priority. And I talk about this a lot on my podcast is in the mornings first thing. And sometimes I'm really good at getting up at 5 and I'll do that for 2 weeks and then I fall off, but sometimes it's 6, sometimes it's 7, whatever. But 15 minutes, 20 minutes in prayer and in worship, and I call it my CEO meeting. It's like in the morning when your CEO, and your CEO is guiding you and setting your and helping you to set that intention for the day and helping you to prioritize and to set focus. Not that that time with God is all about work, and it usually never is, but it really is just allowing his presence to come into my space and into my situation, thanking him for all that he's been doing in my life, praying for my clients, lifting up my family. And it's just it's ground setting. I love to add yoga and some other things. Again, I'm not consistent at that, but if there's one thing I do, it's making that worship with God important and a priority.
Mm, I love
And
to
everything
see.
else is just whatever. Like everything else is kind of a little hectic and crazy with so much going on, but I can count on the one thing.
I love this CEO meeting. That is gonna be a bar for people to just to start your day there, right? That will flow into everything you do. And I think that's a practical way to live out the how do I practically live out that God is first? How do I practically live out where God is my source that directs me for my day and gives me the perspective, the renewal that I need to take on the stuff that I gotta take on. I love that you do a lot of making things practical and real so that people can actually put these things into practice. For that CEO, a lot of times I think when I look around, and part of the reason why this conversation I love to have is that I think we have such a limited view about God's place in the world, right? And so sometimes when I think about policies, I look at the insurance industry, I look at all these industries, I'm like, where are the Christians? I'm like, who said this was okay? Like, has anybody not seen the redemptive narrative? Think about the policies, the models, and all these things. And I do think that there are brothers and sisters who are in that space who may look to you and say, like, I'm here, but like, I just, it just, and sometimes it's a trade off. In order for me to be here, I had to play the game. I had to be shrewd as a serpent, is as a dove. I had to kind of play the game. But I'm here. I don't know what, like, how would you give them hope around starting to explore that journey of what may God be calling them to do, even if potentially it may cost them their job. It may cost them that, hopefully
Yeah.
not. But like I'm pretty sure you have these conversations with the other CEOs and people that you've done work with over the years. Just what hope would you give them to start that journey to say, okay, what may God be asking me to do? And is it helpful for me to do this now, or should I be here longer and have more influence? Just how do you navigate that?
Yeah, it comes up a lot. And I had a friend this week who stood up to her boss around the notion of equity, diversity, and inclusion around women and people of color, and ended up in tears because of the fear of repercussions, the fear of being driven out, the fear of losing her job.
Mm,
And um, very real, and I don't want to minimize the concern and the fear, and I would never judge or look down on anyone who has made a choice that they may not have felt the best about in order to keep their job. That's real. I think, again, as I mentioned earlier, as we grow more and more and become closer to God, God will reassure us in those steps and in standing up and speaking out and understanding the discernment, understanding where God is asking you to speak up, and understanding where God is like, it's okay to remain silent in this situation, I think is really important. But I do know that the reward is great when we stand in the gap. And while that reward may not be how we may see it, we may not keep our job, or this person may not continue to like you or be in partnership or whatever. We have to think long term and big picture on what that can mean. And so I always think about eternity, and I think about at the end of my life, not only will God look on me and say, well done, good and faithful servant, but will the people around me look at my life and say she was true to her faith and what she believed in. And so it takes our mindset off of just today and this paycheck and, this month, but long term, how do I want to live out my life? It's interesting to go back through, and I'm sure people do this all the time, of reading Proverbs and going back, oh, it's, well, today's the 18th, I'm going to read Proverbs 18. But when you go back through and read, it's very repetitive, which means there's important points that are said in there, but God very much melds and blends in the spiritual with the business and the ethical and values. And so that book really has connected the two for me over time, of saying, instead of keeping God over here, bring him into the politics, bring him into the finances. Like, I read all kinds of stuff. I'm like, ooh, this was good. This is like guiding me on my investments, and I need to make this move. And literally after, and I feel like I'm going on a tangent or going
No,
off
you're
a little
not.
bit,
This is
but
tracking. Thank you. Keep rolling.
after my meetings with my CEO, literally I'll have like downloads and drops from the spirit of, reach out to this person you haven't talked to in a long time. Go on LinkedIn and look up this person. And these just little nuggets or breadcrumbs that then lead me to, gosh, this is what I've been looking for and this is what I've been needing. Or even like, make sure you take time and don't neglect your investment portfolio and look at that. Like, God will speak on a lot of different things. And I just call them the mysteries of God, those secret whispers that he wants to open up and reveal to us and share with us.
This is gold. The line streets and revelation of gold. But this is gold. It's a picture of eternity, and I think, I think people will be blessed by this piece, leaving enough space for the mystery of God in their lives. There's a sister, Dalla Agbemi, who I interviewed out of the UK, and she talked about there are times when God, she'd be on social media because she has this digital magazine, a beautiful magazine that's growing all around the UK. And she said, there's one time I was on Pinterest trying to get inspiration, and I felt God checking my spirit, like, you've been on social media too much. God off social media was in his word. And then the inspiration started to come. The thing that she was looking for, in that God had given her that, right, in those moments.
Yes.
And I think it was sometimes hard for that type A, control oriented, empirical, I need to know, is that sometimes God seems too frou-frou, or the word seems irrelevant, right? A shout out to the Proverbs 31, 31 days of March. But God is, no, this is alive and active. And I think there's some power in the things that I'm sharing with you that is going to be relevant to you in the time. And I appreciate how you connect these two. How do people find, like, here's the thing. If you look, you don't have to look long. You will find Olivia Omega, and her community, and the community that we're all part of and grateful to be a part of. But how do people find you and connect with you?
The best place is oliviaomega.com, and kind of all roads are out from there. But you can also find God is CEO podcast anywhere that you listen to podcasts. But I would say those two places to start, obviously on social media.
It was so beautiful hearing the context behind your name. And there's something about the Genesis scripture that you have on your website. And you talk about your name, the greatness, the beauty of your name. And I think what's clear to people who are following and who are learning from you is that you're making his name great. You are making his name great through your work. That Omega certainly is not the end, but it's just the beginning of people going on a journey with God. And I'm so thankful on behalf of brothers and sisters who will hear this and see this. We thank you. We thank you for your faithfulness. We thank you for navigating and giving and equipping brothers and sisters to figure out how to bring God more to the workplace, to the policies, to the products, to the models, and really pushing people to think about brand in a way, in a godly way, that frees them up to be who they're called to be authentically. And so, for that and much more that I can't even enumerate, thank you, sister. Thank you so much for spending this time with us and sharing.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
God bless. Take care.